All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us once again on our Facebook Live series. I'm Andrew Dalton, the director of the Adams County Historical Society in Gettysburg. And if you could let us know in the comments if you can hear and see everything okay, we'd appreciate it just to make sure we're good to go. But I'm very excited about tonight's program. It is a topic that I think hasn't been given a lot of attention in scholarly works and programming. And so I'm really curious to learn even more about it and very happy to have a good friend here with us tonight, Dr. Jill Ogline Titus, who is a professor of history, public history, and Civil War era studies, I believe, at Gettysburg College. I actually had the privilege of having a class with Dr. Titus while I was a student at the college. So this is a real pleasure for me and for the Historical Society to have her here. And she's going to be talking about research related to her book that was just released, I think just a matter of weeks ago. It's called Gettysburg 1963, Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, and Historical Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town. And I'm very excited to get my own copy and start reading it. But I think this will be a great discussion tonight to hear more about Dr. Titus's research and some of these things that may be well known related to Gettysburg, like the presidential visits that you've maybe seen pictures of, but there are a lot of other things going on during this period. So maybe before you get into the presentation, Jill, could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this topic?
Sure, absolutely. Let me just take the squeaky toy away from my dog. He found the one squeaker that I had left.
No problem. Well, and while you do that, I will do something I forgot to do, which is thank the Dobbin House Tavern for being our sponsor for all of our programs this year. I usually remember to say that off the top, but I did not tonight. And I'll also point out we do have a donate button on the video tonight. So if you'd like to support the Adams County Historical Society, help us continue these programs, we'd sure appreciate it. So I think if the chew toy has been neutralized, we'll get started. Thank you.
The chew toy is hidden away, so
sure.
Now we might see the dog. I apologize.
No problem. No problem.
I think you had asked about how I came to write the book.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you had said that this hadn't really been much discussed. And honestly, I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of them is that this book really couldn't be written without the records in the Adams County Historical Society. And I think very few scholars knew that those records existed. This book is not in any way the be all and end all. I hope that other people will follow my footnotes and will trace their way back to the Adams County Historical Society alongside, other repositories. But I came to this project because I was a mid-20th century historian, a historian of civil rights, a public historian who arrived in Gettysburg, lived on Seminary Ridge, spent my days surrounded by the Civil War and my evenings walking along West Confederate Avenue, looking at the monuments. And I was very struck in part by the imagery of a lot of those Confederate monuments. And the more I looked into them, also struck by the dates on which they were dedicated. And as I started delving into the stories behind these monuments, I found that my own field of study, civil rights history, mid-20th century US history, was intersecting with the Civil War and historical commemoration. And so the project was really laid in my lap, and it's been incredibly rewarding and a lot of fun. And it's given me now more of a niche for doing battlefield programs and leading excursions for CWI on the battlefield. So it wasn't a project that I intended to write, but the more I poked around, the more I realized that it was here and it was just waiting to be written.
Well, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. And, I'm sure our members listening and all of our viewers have heard me talk over and over again about, the repository we have here. It is incredible what we're still finding and what we still we'll continue to find over the next decades. So anyway, I'll let you get started into the presentation, Jill, but I might interrupt you if we have any questions or comments that I think are, important to the, furthering the discussion here. And please feel free to put your questions into the comment box at the bottom, and I'll make sure to watch them. But thanks again for being here, Jill. This is a real pleasure for us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it. As I was thinking about how I wanted to frame this conversation this evening, I thought what I might do for this particular group was to focus in on some of the more local and grassroots elements of the Gettysburg Centennial, things that I found record of only in local sources like newspaper archives or oral histories or the collections at ACHS. So I'll give you a little bit of the big picture, but really spend the majority of our time talking about some local dimensions of the centennial. And then I argue in the book that Gettysburg's value as a lens for understanding the intersection of Cold War politics, race in the United States, and Civil War commemoration really lies in the fact that Gettysburg is simultaneously three different things. It's an idea about democracy and self-government. It's a historic landscape of enormous significance, and it's a living community. And when I say living community, I mean that America's most famous small town is made up of real people for whom historical commemoration and debates about the meaning of the Civil War in the present has always been deeply wrapped up in issues of economic vitality, local politics, community development, family heritage. Gettysburg's unique role as an idea, a landscape, and a living community, I believe, means that the centennial anniversary of the battle and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address offers sort of a one-of-a-kind vantage point for exploring the relationship between politics and historical commemoration from a lot of different perspectives and on several different levels. I talk a lot in the book about how these three elements of Gettysburg's identity intersected in efforts to make the 100th anniversary of the Civil War centennial, a vehicle to address some of the issues that Americans were most preoccupied with in the 1960s, particularly racial injustice, national security, the proper relationship between state and federal authority, and the US's reputation on the world stage. But like I said, tonight, I really want to zero in on that living community dimension and talk about the centennial experience from the ground level. Before we can really get into that, though, I think we do need to get a bit of altitude on the issue and sketch out some broader context for understanding the purpose and the framing of this anniversary commemoration. The centennial anniversary of the Civil War took place, obviously, from 1961 to 1965, which, as we all know, was a pretty eventful period in both the US and around the globe. The world's two leading superpowers, the United States and the USSR, were locked in a Cold War battle over whose vision of the future would triumph. Would it be capitalist and democratic, or would it be collectivist and communist? Colonial empires were collapsing around the globe, and dozens of newly independent nations with majority non-white populations were coming into existence in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Back home in the United States, the modern civil rights movement was at its height, as were concerns about national security, particularly in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962. So Americans were, with very good reason, hyper fixated on their image on the world stage. And they wanted that image to be that of a prosperous people bound together by bonds of national kinship, deeply committed to democracy and ready to give all in defense of both their country and its ideals. But the reality, as it usually is, was more complicated. The democracy they held up as inherently superior to communism was in itself deeply flawed. It had never delivered on the promise of equal rights for all. And Black Americans, tired of constant delays in seeing any protection of their constitutional rights, were in the midst of an all-out assault on the bastions of white supremacy. Many white Southerners responded to street demonstrations and marches and direct action protests like sit-ins with violence, attacking protesters with fists, fire hoses, like in this picture from Birmingham, clubs, dogs, much more. White Southerners and political conservatives increasingly were clashing as well, sometimes also violently, with federal officials who were attempting to enforce court decisions and laws upholding equal opportunity. In addition to civil rights clashes, battles over civil liberties in wartime, Cold War time, were widespread as fears of communism continued to haunt most Americans and undermine a lot of progressive causes. So as 1961 dawned, Americans were not unified, and no amount of spin could hide that. In the eyes of the politicians and tourism officials and historians who led the Federal Commission overseeing Civil War commemorative activities, commemorating the war was supposed to be good for the nation's image, both at home and abroad. It was supposed to boost patriotism, draw Americans together across regional and partisan divides, and remind them of how much they had in common. It was supposed to highlight things like duty and sacrifice and martial glory, all in the service of kind of stiffening people's backbones in the present and spreading patriotic narratives of American greatness and American exceptionalism. So to put it mildly, the commemoration of the war did not work out the way that the planners had envisioned. They were hoping for an inspirational celebration of martial masculinity that would hold up the common soldier of both armies as a unifying model of heroism, courage, and patriotism for 20th century Americans, and at the same time boost tourism to Civil War sites. They wanted to commemorate the war without talking about controversial issues or seeming to get into present day politics. But the impossibility of walking that line was obvious as early as April 1961, when the official kickoff for the anniversary became mired in controversy. Centennial leaders not only planned for the commemoration of the firing on Fort Sumter to take place in a whites-only hotel in Charleston without giving its racially discriminatory policies a second thought, but when challenged on that, argued that there was nothing they could do and the event should go forward as planned. The Cliff Notes version, it did not. The PR impact of a federally funded Civil War commemorative commission openly embracing Jim Crow was too much, even for a White House that at the time was trying very hard to keep a low profile on civil rights issues. The Charleston event was a fiasco. The headlines around the world were not flattering, to say the least, but it didn't change Centennial planners' basic approach to portraying the Civil War kind of along the lines of a football rivalry, in which both sides were honored for their good plays, and the conflict's significance drew not from the emancipation of 4 million people or the resolution of questions about the relationship between states and the federal government, but rather the war's role in paving the US's path forward toward 20th century superpower status. Sentimental stories of soldierly self-sacrifice and brother meeting brother on the battlefield got top billing, while things like slavery and emancipation, political division, the continuing racial injustice were all but invisible. As 1963 rolled around, those who were involved in some way with plans for commemorating Gettysburg had a lot of goals for the commemoration. Members of the official planning committees wanted to educate audiences about the battle, draw crowds to Gettysburg, and strengthen patriotic devotion to the nation. Local business owners were particularly interested in strengthening the Adams County economy through catering to visitors' needs and expectations, while National Park Service leaders hoped to boost the NPS's profile with visitors and leverage the centennial to justify building a new museum facility, which they ultimately did. What generations of people have called the old Cyclorama Center was once the new Gettysburg Visitor Center, built to coincide with the centennial commemoration. Preservationists who were horrified by the loss of battlefield land to development and the increased pace of construction on historically significant ground in the county hoped to build popular support for landscape preservation. Despite the focus on reconciliation, though, both Southern heritage groups and Black activists and supporters of civil rights saw inherent opportunities in the Gettysburg commemoration. Confederate heritage groups believed the centennial could advance their goal of memorializing their ancestors and their values on the ground of the nation's most famous Civil War landscape, helping to ensure their conviction that the Confederacy was an exemplar of American values would be passed on to future generations of visitors. Black activists, white progressives, members of the Pennsylvania state level Human Relations Commission, for their part, saw in the anniversary commemoration a rare opportunity to leverage widespread concerns about racial incidents marring Gettysburg's image to combat segregation and discrimination in Adams County. So claiming and reclaiming, really, memorial space played a key role in all of these things. The centennial years significantly altered the battlefield's commemorative landscape. It brought new land under park management, turned Ziegler's Grove into the new interpretive heart of the visitor experience, and ushered in a wave of Confederate monumentation along Seminary Ridge that would continue for the next 15 years. The transformation of that ridge into full-fledged Confederate memorial space testifies really to the entrenchment of traditional narratives of reconciliation and states' rights during the 100th anniversary. But at the same time, the centennial years also saw a decrease in overt segregation in Adams County and the beginnings of a somewhat more racially inclusive and historically complex narrative of Gettysburg's meaning. So hopefully that gives us some big picture background. So we can now kind of get back to that view from the ground level. And I thought it might be interesting to focus on 4 particular dimensions of local activities: land preservation, historical pageantry, economic development, and racial justice. Preservation, we all know, has been an important issue in Adams County politics since 1864. But by 1961, concerns over the encroachment of commercial enterprises around park boundaries, and conversely, concerns about the need to broaden the tax base had reached fever pitch. Lack of zoning regulations, a growing population, and the new amenities associated with the expansion of automobile-based tourism in the late 1950s and early 1960s produced a landscape that bore a pretty strong resemblance to tourist destinations like Niagara Falls or Gatlinburg. The last straw for a lot of people was the county commissioner's 1959 decision to sell the land surrounding the old Poor Farm site to the highest bidder on the grounds that the county needed funds to build a new home for the aged. There was one disgruntled visitor wrote the Department of the Interior about this, lamenting that downtown Gettysburg had become a farce. She had no issues with private enterprise, she said, but here, let me read you the quote. "Here is practiced highway robbery without the benefit of a gun."
That's great.
A Washington Post reporter said basically the same thing, warning that if anybody planned to stage a reenactment in 1963, Picket's men might be making their charge through a custard stand or a souvenir shop. When NPS officials tried to point out that Gettysburg National Military Park had lost access to more than $1 million earmarked for acquiring threatened battlefield land because of the absence of local zoning laws, many residents claimed that the Department of the Interior was trying to ram economically crippling zoning measures down local people's throats. So the end result of all of this was really two-pronged. On one level, Adams County's reputation on a national scale took a hit. But on the other, the crisis birthed a new group committed to achieving preservation, not through public funding or zoning laws, but rather outright purchase of threatened lands through private donations. Mm-hmm. Parade magazine ran a story on Gettysburg's preservation woes in January of 1961. offering readers an opportunity to donate to the newly formed Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association by purchasing a Civil War portfolio of maps and images. And in response, donations poured in from around the country, as did letters to the Gettysburg Times excoriating the county commissioners as small-minded and morally bankrupt. These letters are very entertaining, actually. If you ever want to look for
That's
some
amazing. Wow.
intriguing reading, they make for it. One parade reader, who apparently had no elderly family members in his own family, argued caustically that a new home for the aged wasn't necessary because most of the people in it would die within 10 years anyway. Terribly sympathetic perspective. Another one took a more serious tone, arguing that the land involved might be in Adams County, but that did not give the commissioners the right to do whatever they wanted with it. The battlefield, he said, belonged to the nation. Thus the title of this talk for this evening. A woman who claimed that her husband had played on Gettysburg's, again, quote, blood-soaked field in a potato sack dress at 4 years old, end quote, intriguing letter, angrily demanded that the White House divert funds from European handouts to battlefield preservation. The letters did not save the property. Wise Market and the Hack campus are testimony to that fact. But the loss of the Poor Farm site sparked increased support for the work of the GBPA, allowing the organization to acquire several properties during the centennial years, all of which were promptly turned over to the Park Service. Officers of the organization made really effective use of the publicity value of the centennial in their efforts, arguing that if land didn't get saved in 1963 while the eyes of the world were on Gettysburg, it would be lost forever. At the same time that county residents were fending off criticisms from around the country for being small-minded, money-grubbing, or insufficiently respectful of the resource that they'd been entrusted with, they were also taking active steps to commemorate the centennial anniversary in ways that really resonated on a community level. The vast majority of the vision and energy driving the Gettysburg Centennial in its early years was actually local in origin and focus. A state-level Gettysburg Centennial Commission had been established in 1956 to coordinate commemoration of both the battle anniversary and the anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, but it was slow to find its footing. Members of the Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission, the ACCWCC, which I don't even know if that's shorter as an acronym or if that's just as long as things. But they, on the other hand, really hit the ground running. Assuming that the GCC would ultimately pull it together in time to adequately commemorate the men who fought at Gettysburg, which they did, the Adams County Commission took as its charge the responsibility of honoring county residents who served between 1861 and 1865 and educating people about Adams County's role in the war from Fort Sumter to Appomattox. The group kicked off its programming efforts in April 1961 by mounting a large pageant reenacting the events of April 21st and 22nd, 1861, when the men of the Independent Blues, the first regiment of local men to depart for wartime service, were escorted to the train station by cheering crowds. The pageant was written by a committee of local residents under the direction of Betty Gifford, and it featured a cast of more than 300 people, including many prominent local residents in key roles. The county commissioners, the town council president, the burgess, they all put on they all grew mustaches, grew out their sideburns, put on costumes, and went out to portray their 1861 predecessors. The Gettysburg College band filled in for the community band that had performed in 1861. And high school students put on the uniforms of the National Cadets, a teenage military group that had formed with the departure of the Blues. And the fact that Daniel Skelly Jr., the son of the cadets captain, was able to portray his own father in this pageant was really testimony to the narrowness of the chasm that separated the past from present in a small community in which many residents were direct descendants of the war generation. I have a picture of the Independent Blues pageant here. The Historical Society has some wonderful, wonderful images in its collection of these local events. They're really fun to look at.
And I think we have people watching who actually were at this, that they have a couple people have commented that they remember.
That's fantastic. Oh, I'd love to talk to those people. A lot of the, in addition to all of these local people, members of the reenactment group, the North-South Skirmish Association, which was still pretty new at this point, represented the Home Guard unit that fired a cannon to mark the Blues' departure. Reenacting was a rapidly growing hobby in the early 1960s, but it was still new enough that apparently nobody anticipated the fact that firing a cannon in the center of Lincoln Square could be a problem until 16 windows near the railroad station were shattered. But wow. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but the newspaper articles were quite funny about it. But the event was a great success. There were more than, according to the Times, there were more than 3,000 people there. And inspired by that success, the Adams County Commission mounted 2 more pageants the following year, commemorating a flag presentation to the men of the 10th New York Cavalry and Jeb Stuart's October 1862 cavalry raids on the towns of Cashtown and Fairfield. So while Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission members were working on pageants and Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association members were working on raising money for preservation, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, better known as the JCs, launched a campaign to restore the exterior of the downtown business district to its 1863 appearance on the grounds that historically accurate architecture and a larger tree canopy would draw tourists to the downtown core. And former President Dwight Eisenhower, who was a champion of private and voluntary action as opposed to governmental action, was a really important supporter of this project, which ultimately got funding from the Saturday Evening Post. Wow. By early 1963, more than 75% of the buildings identified for historical improvements had seen at least some alterations. And representatives of the Post lauded the campaign as a triumph of what they called commercial democracy. Things didn't end in 1963. There were ongoing efforts, particularly to remove modern illuminated signs from the downtown area. But otherwise, Campaign Gettysburg officially culminated at the end during the battle anniversary week with a Civil War sing-along on the square, a week of Campaign Gettysburg sales days in the shops surrounding the square, and a Civil War drummer boy contest. Apparently, the JCs treated participants and their families to lunch and a day at Fantasyland after the contest. And these Campaign Gettysburg sales days sound very interesting. Participating merchants competed for the honor of having the best Civil War themed shop windows. They garbed their frontline staff in period dress, and they distributed paper Confederate money to shoppers to use in a special auction. Many of the same merchants also placed historically themed advertisements in the special centennial edition of the Gettysburg Times, printed on June 30th. By the mid-20th century, many Americans enthusiastically subscribed to the belief that history not only provided a window into modern national character, but that consumer goods provided a means to reclaiming essential American values. A sizable number of the ads that ran in this special issue were historically themed, but not specific to the Civil War. Many, like the one promoting Bear's department store, aimed to kind of tug at the heartstrings of a generalized nostalgia for the past in viewers and prompt them to associate certain products or services with supposedly historic small town values like, quality craftsmanship, honesty, integrity. But there were others that made specific connections to the battle and the overall history of the Civil War. Dengler Brothers Grocery, in their ad, informed readers that the armies came to Gettysburg by chance, not by choice, but promised that you can choose and eat hearty at bargain prices. Columbia Gas of Pennsylvania, here's the ad here, capitalized on the fact that the eternal peacelight flame was fueled by natural gas, stressing gas's role in uniting the American economy. Many advertisements incorporated both Union and Confederate flags and the phrase, "We play honor," to assure visitors of varying regional and political loyalties that local business owners were properly respectful of the valor of what they would have called both sides. Some explicitly embraced the narrative that the Civil War laid the groundwork for the United States to grow into a global superpower. Gettysburg Glass Company's advertisement claimed that the battle brought unity to our country, a sentiment that no doubt would have perplexed most Civil War soldiers. While many ads lionized the armies of 1863 for fighting for, quote, a cause in which they believed, end quote, none attempted to define that cause, testimony to the enduring power of right reconciliation in the popular mind. Campaign Gettysburg participants and Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission members shared a concern for architectural and landscape preservation with the GBPA and with NPS staff, and many were likely enthusiastic about the Cold War framing of Gettysburg as a site of patriotic unity and the source of the democratic vision guiding the free world. But this did not mean that either their use of battle narratives or their reasons for remembering the Civil War were identical to those held by NPS officials or GCC members. In addition to their vested interest in economic interest in Civil War history and tourism and their strong sense of place, as I said before, many local residents had strong family ties connecting them to the events of 1861 to 1865. Notwithstanding Gettysburg's widespread fame, it was a small town where family connections were of paramount importance, and many inhabitants were directly descended from wartime residents. Despite the passage of time, family stories thus played a key role in shaping local people's understandings of the battle and underlay some of their enthusiasm for historical commemoration. This strong emphasis on family connections linking 1863 to 1963 was particularly visible in the Adams County Commission's final large-scale pageant commemorating the June 27th capture of Gettysburg by Jubal Early's cavalry and the death of George Washington Sando, the first Adams County resident killed during the battle. The program involved more than 600 people in cast, crew, and animal handler roles, and included a parade, a mock skirmish in the downtown area, as you sort of see here, a reenactment of the capture of the courthouse, and a scripted scene recreating the delivery of Early's demands to Borough Council President David Kendall-Hart. A descendant portrayed Sando, and the role of David Kendall-Hart went to his grandson, Joseph.
Wow.
While pride in family history and a desire to make the centennial economically profitable certainly played a central role in motivating many local people to take part in commemorative activities, members of the state level Gettysburg Centennial Commission, the GCC, focused more on upholding the state's and the nation's reputation, boosting Pennsylvania's tourist economy and fighting the Cold War. By late 1962, the GCC had laid the groundwork for a battle anniversary commemoration that would heighten public understanding of, here I'll quote, the immense reserves of bravery, of sacrifice, and of idealism which lie in the American character. Both GCC and ACC, WCC members were captivated by the idea of a grand patriotic spectacle that would stir participants' historical imaginations and rouse their emotions. Such a spectacle, they hoped, would include parades, pageants, and an elaborate sound and light show on the battlefield, which was struck down with essentially no questions asked by the National Park Service. For help in mounting this kind of program, the GCC turned to Adele Gutman Nathan, the successful producer of several large-scale historical pageants, charging her with developing theatrical programs for the event and arranging a massive parade, the highlight of which turned out to be a National Guard float featuring a soldier taking a shower in a mobile bath unit. Sadly, I have not been able to find any pictures of
Oh my
that.
gosh, wow.
But if the Historical Society,
Well, look.
those floating around,
Yep,
I would love to see them. Nathan told reporters that it was her job to bring the wow factor. These people are historians, she said. They know history, but they don't know show business, and that's what this is. Nathan quickly established a partnership with Betty Gifford, the chairperson of the local Civil War Centennial Commission's Pageant Committee, turning over to her the responsibility of developing a series of human interest themed historical vignettes for performance on July 2nd and 3rd. The vignettes, which ran between 3 to 6 minutes apiece and were restaged repeatedly throughout the day, were really popular with visitors. Though NPS officials privately claimed that they left a lot to be desired in terms of historical accuracy. This one, Life Saved by a Gentleman, featured the familiar but likely embellished story of Confederate General John B. Gordon saving the life of Union General Francis Barlow. And Friendly Enemies depicted a historically inaccurate reconciliationist tableau of opposing forces playing cards together after filling their canteens together at Spangler's Spring. Brother Captures Brother was a sentimental story of two brothers torn apart by war encountering each other on the battlefield, and A Valiant General, a Noble Man, hit all the lost cause marks in its portrayal of Robert E. Lee. John Burns, Venerable Citizen Warrior, focused on the well-known story of the elderly man who joined Union troops in defending his home on July 1st. The Fateful Decision portrayed Meade's July 2nd Council of War, and Sharpshooters Roos depicted the action around Devil's Den. Gifford recruited really widely for volunteers for the vignettes, and the vast majority of the 90+ people who participated in them were locals. Roy Maitland was cast as General John Gordon in the Barlow-Gordon vignette because he could supply his own horse. And Jim Witt was assigned to Sharpshooters Roos because the principal at the school at which he taught told him to volunteer. In addition to serving as cast members, local residents also did the research for these. They wrote the scripts, they gathered the props, sewed some of the costumes, did makeup, served as directors. The 7 vignettes were designed to capture visitors' attention by connecting them on an emotional level to the experiences of men in battle, to get beyond tactics and what line moved where and who captured what hill, and really make that human connection. And Betty Gifford's commitment to these vignettes was such that she soldiered on despite her husband suffering a heart attack that kept him hospitalized through the battle anniversary week. Sharpshooters Roos proved to be a really difficult vignette to stage. Gettysburg National Military Park forbade cutting any underbrush or trampling the fields around Devil's Den, and reproduction firearms were in really short supply. One of the directors of the vignette ultimately scrounged up some World War I era Springfield rifles, and the park ranger assigned to direct traffic in Devil's Den during the performances convinced the National Guard to loan the cast some smoke grenades. So according to the participant who I interviewed about this, hour after hour, cast members chased each other back and forth across the road, snaking through Devil's Den. But they abandoned the grenades after deciding that orange smoke was just a little bit too anachronistic. Betty Gifford estimated later that more than 50,000 people viewed the 200 vignette performances. Some audience members returned multiple times to specific programs, but we know that there was at least one viewer who walked the whole 7-mile circuit between them in order to see them all. I talked with a participant in one of these a few years ago who was pretty unstinting in his criticism. He called them amateur in execution, historically and dramatically miserable, full of inaccuracies, and totally devoid of any allusion to the causes and consequences of the battle. At the time, however, many viewers, with the exception of NPS historians, had a much more positive assessment of their value. The president of the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable proclaimed that the vignettes, cast and crew did more with a few dollars than the state did with more than $128,000. The Gettysburg Times reported that parents were so unnerved by John Corver's realistic portrayal of General Barlow's injuries that they covered their children's eyes.
That's amazing.
For most of the reenactors participating in the commemoration, the highlight was the July 3rd Pickets Charge program, described by the Gettysburg Centennial Commission chairman, Milton Baker, as, quote, an opportunity to interpret the battlefield in a way that will emphasize our present position as a great nation united under a single flag. Many of the roughly 1,500 uniformed participants were descendants of Civil War veterans. Interestingly, at least a few were female. The 104th Ohio included 8 women in uniform. A handful of the participants were children. All of the Union units were from northern states, but some of the Confederate groups were also made up of Northerners, really a testimony to the popularity of Confederate reenacting and perhaps Confederate ideology outside of the South. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York had both Union and Confederate units represented, and the only New Jerseyans participating in the reenactment were wearing gray. The crowds were, for this event, for once, kind of on target with what was expected. The weather that week was incredibly hot, and on both July 1st and July 2nd, the projected crowds were significantly lower than had been anticipated. But on July 3rd, the weather had kind of broken, and the records suggest that there were probably about 40,000 people out near the angle to view this event. And that really posed some challenges for the park rangers and state troopers and Boy Scouts who were charged with crowd control. A few arguments broke out over obstructed views, the worst of which was a spontaneous rushing of the elevated platform holding news cameras by angry members of the crowd who apparently shook it back and forth as the cameraman on top hung on for dear life. You can see in the photo a little bit some of the flags that the Confederate units carried. These flags were hand sewn, and they carried them across the field, approaching the angle slowly. They climbed over the fences lining Emmitsburg Road, pushed back a skirmishing force of Union soldiers, and processed between 2 rows of speakers broadcasting recorded gunfire and battle sounds. By directive of the NPS, which had a firm ban on reenactments on battlefield land by 1963, this was a symbolic reenactment. Participants were barred from loading their weapons or pointing their arms at the enemy or simulating injury or death. Smoke pots were used instead to provide visual effects. As the attackers neared the Union line, both sides lowered their weapons and clutched each other's hands, and many of the participants cried. In the ultimate gesture of unity and reconciliation, the Navy band played the national anthem while all the participants assembled at attention behind the angle to salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's very likely that a lot of members of the crowd perceived the event through Cold War lenses, embracing the Union victory at the high water mark as the event that prevented the nation from becoming permanently divided, thus providing it the power it would need a century later to counterbalance the Soviet Union on the world stage. Lost cause devotees, however, whether or not they pledged allegiance to the US flag at the end of the program, likely also felt a profound sense of loss and grief at that moment. Some attendees who had a more emancipationist understanding of the battle or believed that the Civil War could be used to advance the cause of racial justice might have experienced feelings of joy or satisfaction as they watched the program. The percentage of the crowd who might have subscribed to that point of view is very much of a question mark. The Harrisburg Patriot claimed that several hundred Black families attended the event, but I haven't been able to corroborate that assertion anywhere else. It's certainly not in any kind of, in any of the park's documentation. What we do know for sure, though, was that organizers who feared civil rights demonstrations were most anxious at that moment in which Confederate reenactors moved out from Seminary Ridge. They knew that if a protest were to take place in the middle of the recreated assault, it would have huge symbolic value. And thanks to all the news cameras present, would quickly circulate around the world. So I think that raises, a question that we need to consider. Could civil rights demonstrations have conceivably taken place on the fields of Pickets Charge? Yes, certainly. Let's keep in mind that the summer of 1963 began with the use of police dogs and fire hoses against Black protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. George Wallace's political theater in Tuscaloosa. A few weeks later, he was here in Gettysburg participating in this ceremony, and the murder of NAACP leader Medgar Evers. And the summer ended with the March on Washington and the arrests of 15,000 people across the nation for engaging in protests and demonstrations. Many Black Americans, including those who had never before imagined themselves engaging in direct action protest, were just done with being told that they had to wait until a good time to enjoy their constitutional rights. They were deaf to pleas that they hold off on protest until a supposedly more appropriate time. And there was a lot to protest in Gettysburg. At the dawn of the 1960s, Black Gettysburgians, who made up 3% of the borough's population, continued to struggle against segregation and discrimination in housing and employment. Professional clerical and retail positions downtown remained pretty much closed to African Americans. And with the exception of Adam Myers, a pioneering figure at the post office, Black faces were rarely seen in the downtown core. Black students in the integrated public school system were frequently treated differently than their white peers, and some local establishments still upheld segregation in public accommodations. Black families who sought homes outside the crowded, traditionally Black segments of the Third Ward encountered resistance and obstruction on the part of real estate agents, bankers, lenders, and neighboring residents. Adam Myers was one of the most publicly outspoken leaders in Gettysburg's Black community in this era, and was the central force behind a loose coalition of residents who repeatedly challenged the color barrier in local businesses and entertainment venues. Myers cautioned members of the Gettysburg Rotary Club in May 1963 not to assume that local Blacks were satisfied simply because their pride and commitment to nonviolence prevented them from acting as confrontationally as their neighbors in some other communities had done. He framed his message very much in the context of the centennial, warning that the eyes of the world were focused on Gettysburg, and any racial incidents could bring in outside agitations. Outside agitations, that's an idea and very much a phrase often used by conservative whites to argue that their African-American neighbors were content and that agitation always came from the outside. So in using that term, that Myers was likely playing a shrewd game He understood that the centennial offered a brief opportunity to shine the spotlight of public opinion on racial injustice in Gettysburg. He knew how much white residents and anniversary organizers feared the specter of direct action protest, concerned that the community's reputation would be tarnished on the national stage. He was undoubtedly also familiar with the concern that communist powers would like nothing better than to portray Gettysburg, the premier symbol of US commitment to freedom and self-government, as just yet another American community in which racial oppression ran unchecked. The continuing presence of segregation and discrimination in Adams County was prevalent enough that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission launched a campaign in spring 1963 to prevent discrimination against battle anniversary visitors. PHRC representatives called on local business owners in person to remind them that Pennsylvania had a public accommodations law right here in front of us, and direct them to post non-discrimination notices in their windows, which, as is noted in the text, is part of the law itself. It's hard to quantify the impact of that campaign, but it likely served as a pretty effective warning to local businesses that they would be under scrutiny, at least through the remainder of the centennial year. When asked by nervous local whites about rumors that civil rights demonstrations were planned for July 3rd, Joseph Hagler, a Black clergyman who was based in Carlisle, actually, but had a lot of connections and spent a lot of time in Gettysburg and in Adams County, suggested that it might depend on whether or not local motels treated patrons of color fairly. He said he had gotten a lot of calls from people who had reservations and were concerned that those reservations were not going to be honored when they showed up and the clerk saw the color of their skin. When the mayor of Gettysburg, William Weaver, issued his official welcome to centennial visitors in late June, he went out of his way to assure attendees that, quote again, without exception, their hotel and motel reservations will be honored, and everyone will be served in the restaurants as quickly and courteously and well as possible.
Wow.
I think, yeah, it's really interesting. When you trace back from that proclamation to everything that happened before, I think it's clear that the Human Relations Commission played a role in forcing the mayor's hand. But I would also argue that the primary force prompting him to make such a direct assurance was almost certainly the widespread fear that civil rights demonstrations would expose the community, and by extension, the nation itself, since Gettysburg was seen as a stand-in for the nation, to criticism both at home and abroad. By 1963, overt segregation and public accommodations have been on the decline in Gettysburg for several years, thanks both to the actions of Adam Myers and others, and the escalating nationwide campaign against Jim Crow. But the centennial anniversary, nonetheless, provided a valuable opportunity to use the town's moment in the spotlight to accelerate the process of change, to speed things up and guard against backsliding. Okay, so to wrap up, Gettysburg Centennial was many things to many people. It boosted the tourist economy. It sparked new kinds of preservation campaigns, both architectural and landscape focused. It profoundly altered the landscape of Gettysburg National Military Park. It spurred large-scale popular participation in grassroots pageantry and helped provide leverage for desegregation. Members of the Gettysburg Centennial Commission hoped to de-emphasize the divisiveness of the Civil War in anniversary programming, yet thanks to the disparate views of the speakers invited to participate, ceremonial activities marshaled not only reconciliationist, but also emancipationist and lost cause interpretations of the battle for contemporary purposes. And these contemporary purposes included both justifying and opposing the Civil Rights Bill before Congress that summer, decrying the impact of American racial abuses on the nation's foreign policy goals, calling for equal justice in housing and education, linking the Black freedom struggle with communism, and portraying civil rights activists, as unpatriotic agitators. By contrast, programs like the popular Vignettes of History series and the July 3rd Pickets Charge program were more uniformly reconciliationist in tone, using patriotic spectacle and human scale stories to reinforce the message that we are all Americans. Adams County residents were involved at all levels of centennial programming, including serving on the GCC. They worked closely with their compatriots and the state commission at some times, like in producing the battlefield vignettes, and at other times mounted their own distinctly grassroots commemorative efforts. In his farewell letter to the community of Gettysburg, the executive director of the GCC, Lewis Simon, not only praised residents lavishly for their wholehearted cooperation, but raised a glass to the borough of Gettysburg itself as truly worthy of the high place that an accident of history gave to it. So I think that's a good place to end. If there have been questions that have come in, I would love to take a stab at some of them.
Sure. And a lot of them are actually comments saying that people remember a lot of the things that you're talking about, which is just fascinating. Our good friend Tom says that he was at the Pickets Charge field and it was so covered in smoke. And he says, I think sarcastically, of course, very realistic, that it made it very hard to actually see anything. So I wonder if that's something you encountered, that people were there but didn't really, see much of what was going on.
Yes. I encountered many, particularly letters written after the fact to people involved with the Adams County Commission, like friends who had gone to this. There were a lot of letters saying, it was really cool, but I couldn't hear anything. The sound system wasn't very good. I couldn't see anything except the back of the person in front of me. And I think that's why people got so angry about that platform for the news cameras. I mean, there really was a moment that it seemed like something very dangerous might happen there. But yeah, I read a number of accounts saying that unless you were near the front, seeing and hearing was challenging.
Yeah, that's amazing. One question about Eisenhower. Did he have any real active role in the ceremonies, on during the core ceremony?
Well, it's interesting. Eisenhower was technically, he was the honorary chairman of the Gettysburg Centennial Commission, the state commission. Wow. But his role in the summer anniversary and the battle anniversary was incredibly limited. The only thing that he was involved in was a program sponsored by the firemen, the firemen's annual commemoration on June 30th, and he gave a speech at the high school field, the high school stadium, that was roundly criticized as being tone deaf and totally out of step with the themes of the commemoration. He never mentioned civil rights. He spent most of it talking about the importance of not accepting government handouts and the need for a sturdy kind of self-reliance that wow. He argued that the government for the people, by the people would only survive through sturdy self-reliance, and if people looked to the government to do too much for them, democratic government would collapse. However, wow. He was more involved in the November commemoration, the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. He presided over the rededication of the National Cemetery. His remarks there were much more open-ended, much more open-ended. And while they still were not explicitly about civil rights, those who were advocating for civil rights could read those remarks as being about civil rights. Others could read them differently, and he was and participated in a much more diverse, sort of multiracial program. So some commentators seem to think, maybe Eisenhower took something from those criticisms of his July speech and came at it differently from at November. And other people said, I think it's more the tenor of the event. The events are different. The November commemoration, which I'm sorry I didn't get to talk about tonight because it's really, really fascinating. And actually, I spend a lot of time on it in the book. Right. It was more cerebral. It was a lot more focused on international politics. It was more diverse. It was more emancipationist in focus. It was much more of a thought exercise, whereas the battle anniversary commemoration was a little more entertaining, a little more participatory in nature.
Right. That's fascinating. Yeah. If there are any other questions, now is the time to type them in the box, but I'll ask one more question. I've always thought it was just fascinating, and this is more related to November, that Kennedy is assassinated literally just a few days, is it maybe 2 or 3 days after this huge event at the National Cemetery. And Lyndon Johnson is it correct? Was he here as the speaker at that event?
No, Lyndon Johnson was here in May at the Memorial Day ceremony.
Okay. Who was the keynote in November?
It was Eisenhower.
It was Eisenhower. Okay.
And William Scranton, the governor of Pennsylvania. Right. They invited Kennedy.
Yes, and I know we have the one of my favorite things in our collection is the parade route. It says, Kennedy's car is going to take this path, kind of chilling to see that, because they obviously had one of those in Dallas too, that they had probably worked up for that, if he, I wonder if, was there a lot of deliberation about, whether he was going to go here or there? There's been a lot of things written and talked about, regarding why he made that decision, but what did you come across in your research about, the decision of Kennedy not to come to Gettysburg?
Well, Kennedy was invited twice. He was invited in the summer to preside over a day of activities on July 4th that would have taken the theme Forever Free and actually might have introduced a more emancipationist perspective to the battle narrative. He declined. He's invited again in November. And some people have wondered, did that mean that Kennedy didn't see Gettysburg as significant as his predecessors had? If Woodrow Wilson came here, if Ronald, what am I talking about?
No, I understand.
Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Sure. They were all
they
here.
Came here, but Kennedy didn't. Did that mean Kennedy thought it was less significant? My answer to that is no. And I think that but I think that anybody who had been paying attention could have predicted that would have happened. Kennedy tried very hard to keep the commemorative activities at arm's length. I mentioned the Charleston events that he had to get involved, but he tried to do it in a quiet and unobtrusive way. Sure. In September of 1962, he was supposed to give the keynote at the one official commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation, which took place on the Mall. And at the very, just a few days before the ceremony, he pulled out on the grounds that he had to take this trip to Europe. Wow. But it was very clear that he saw the Civil War centennial as a political football and as an opportunity to lose points with everybody. If he seemed to be too focused on emancipation or tried to make a connection between the Civil War and racial issues in the present, that would lose that balance of white Southerners. But if he but if he didn't address it, that would severely, damage his support amongst African Americans. So he tried to duck the issue. And when he was invited to Gettysburg, he did a lot of stalling, maybe I'll come. For months, he just, kind of put them off. And then 2 months in advance, no, I'm sorry, I can't come. The same thing happened in November.
Right. That's just fascinating. Yeah. And after the Kennedy assassination, do you think this is my last question, I promise, for those of you watching. No. Do you think after the Kennedy assassination, there was any kind of shift in the narrative or the thinking around monumentation of the battlefield with Lyndon Johnson and his policies? Or do you think it was kind of people weren't really making the connection to race at that point, and connecting monuments to racial issues the way that we might now?
I think it was happening, although I don't think Kennedy had anything to do with it.
Okay.
One of the things that I find most fascinating with the memorial landscape and the 1963 anniversary is to look at the enormous differences in tone and context between the dedication of the South Carolina monument and the Florida monument. Those were dedicated July 2nd to July 3rd, so one day apart.
Wow.
The South Carolina monument, it's a very full-throated states' rights, defense of the Constitution, featured George Wallace in a leading role as a keynote speaker, railing against federal encroachment on the liberties of southern states and the liberties of individual business owners. Florida monument, the speaker there spends one sentence talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, and the entire rest of the speech he devotes to the way that American racial abuses are destroying the nation's reputation on an international scale. Wow. There's this fascinating line, something like, "We cannot hope to win men's hearts and minds in the battle against communism if we show that democracy in America is only for the white man." So I think there were many clear attempts during the anniversary to use monuments or monument dedications or monument rededications for very presentist political perspectives, but there's also great diversity in the narratives that are being deployed on this landscape. What I think is the last thing I'll say is what I think is really interesting is you see clearly, if you look in the records, that there is pressure being applied to the National Park Service at the Washington level, pressure coming from powerful Southern congressmen and senators to speed up approval processes, to get inscriptions approved the way they are written, to accept certain imagery. And I think that plays a large part in why many of the monuments dedicated along Seminary Ridge in the 1960s and 1970s feature imagery and wording that were absolutely, forbidden in an earlier generation of monumentation here at Gettysburg.
Right. Yeah. Union veterans, of course, speaking out very strongly against any kind of glorification on Confederate monuments. That's fascinating. Wow. Well, this has been a really amazing discussion. I want to thank everybody who's watched, and if you have further questions, I'm sure if you reach out to us, we'll pass them along to Dr. Titus. And I also posted in the comments the link to her book on Amazon. So if you'd like to get a copy, I'm sure she'll eventually do a book signing or something with us, and you can bring it and have it signed. But thank you again, everybody, for watching tonight, and thank you, Dr. Titus, for being here with us.
Thank you, everybody. This has been fun.
All right. Good night. And also we do have a donate button. So if you want to support the Historical Society in our program series, if you can press the donate button on this post, it'll go a long way. And you can also donate on our website. And thank you all so much for your continued support and for watching our programs and following us on Facebook and our emails. And we're working hard on our new museum, and we'll have more for you on that in the coming weeks. So thank you for being part of our success, and hope everybody has a good night.